Hi students, in this next set of videos we are going to explore another method for animating the motion of objects, and we call this path constraint, a path animation. So what does that even mean? Why would we care? Say we want to do an animation with our teapot where it sort of follows kind of a meandering path as it glides along, like it goes kind of like in a serpentine pattern. Maybe it leans to the side as it's turning, and we want it to look like it's like the spout is aiming forward as it goes. This type of animation could be used maybe to animate the flight of a plane or a spacecraft. You want it to be able to go around and follow a kind of a unique path through the scene, and that's really something you can't achieve with straight keyframing. So we use what's called a path constraint in order to achieve that. So a path, which is, we all know what a path is, it's a track that something follows, whether you're hiking on a path or whether you're, it's a thing to follow. So in 3ds Max, how do we make a path? Well, we have in our Create tab with our plus, next door to our Geometry tab, we have another tab called the Shapes tab. And there are a whole bunch of shapes that we can create. And I am going to show you, we're going to work with the line and we're going to work with the circle. But first, let's start with the line. So when we create a line, we can actually, it's very similar to like drawing a line in Photoshop. If you click and drag, the vertex that it creates actually has a little handle on it, and we'll see that in a moment. If you do a quick click, you form a corner. And when we're done, we right click, and there's our path. So if we click the selection tool, we grab our path and we head over to the Modify tab, we can see that we have a line. And this might resemble the Edit Poly window a little bit. When we draw a line or a shape, we have the option to view the individual vertices that make up the line. And earlier when I was saying handles, that's what I meant. So if we look at one of these tough corners, we see we don't get any handles on it. We just have a straight corner, straight edge there. Whereas these guys, since I clicked and dragged to form them, I was able to actually create a kind of a curved thing. So we can do a few things with this path. If we have the Move tool selected, we can actually drag those handles and drag the location of that point to fine-tune exactly how the path is actually shaped. And I'm looking at it from the top viewport, keep in mind. Now another thing that we can do is we can make our path, we can raise some of it up in the Z direction. So if we want our teapot to actually go up in the air, we can use the left viewport, right click to select, and then drag that point upward. So this can get a little messy when you do it, so that's why using your top and your side viewports to work with 2 directions at a time, that's helpful. So if we right click back in our perspective and we sort of zoom around and take a look at our path, we can see that once we put our teapot on the path, it's going to move side to side, and then it's going to float upward and then come back downward. And when it gets to the end of that animation, it's going to take a couple really sharp corners. So this is a really efficient way to have an object move and do a bunch of stuff with not very much effort or work, or steps, I should say. Not effort, I should say steps. Okay, so we've created our path, we have it do some things, we worked in the vertex selection, and we need to make sure that we unselect that when we're done, and we can see those vertexes have disappeared, and now we just have our regular move tool again. And when we have our regular move tool and we drag, our line will move in one big piece instead of by vertex point. All right, so now that we have our path that our teapot will follow, we need to get our teapot to follow the path. And we are going to venture into another new territory here in our control module panel thing, and it is this guy, the motion tab. There's a lot that can go on in the motion tab. So I'm going to do this slowly, and I'm going to do it step by step so that you don't get lost. So we are going to click on position because we want to assign a controller. We want to tell the computer to take control over the position of the teapot, where it is in space. Okay, so we have that selected. We are going to assign a controller. We're kind of giving the computer the reins here. And we're going to tell the computer that we want to use a path constraint. We want the computer to use this line as a reference for where the teapot is going to be going over the course of the animation. So we're going to click OK. Now, initially, once you've done that, nothing happens, but that's because you have to scroll down where it says path parameters and click add path and then click on the path. So now you saw two things happened. First of all, we now see the line over here, and now we see that the teapot is now at the beginning of our curve here. So let's hit play and let's see what happens. There we go. Teapot's zooming along there. This is only a 90-second animation. So teapot covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time. And I really don't want this taskbar here. It should actually have dropped. It shouldn't have been here. Oh well. Back to business. So we've assigned our teapot to the path, and maybe we want it to follow the path. We talked at the beginning about how we wanted the teapot to look like it's the spout is facing forward. So if we turn on the follow option, the teapot will actually rotate automatically so that it looks like it's actually turning and the spout is going forward based on the direction of movement. And that's a simple setting, the follow setting. Now, the bank setting is actually pretty cool, and this again applies like if you're animating the movement of an airplane. The teapot will actually kind of lean when it goes around a corner. See? Here it comes, leaning again, and see how it's banking there? Watch if you turn the bank off. See how it goes straight? So the bank, the teapot will kind of like bank in as though it was on a roller coaster track or something. And again, you can edit the amount of bank that happens, which is fine. And yeah, that's it. You can achieve other weird results by changing the axis of the object, so we don't really want to do that because as it stands now, it's working just fine. So, yes. So there's our animation. I got rid of the taskbar because I think we all agreed at the beginning that 3 seconds is a little fast for this animation. And this tends to happen in real life. You know, you think that you have an idea of how long you want something to take, and then once you start building it, you realize that it's either, you know, way too much time or too little time. Even though we try our best to plan, sometimes we have to make adjustments. So in this case, since we've been working with the same 3ds Max session, we ended up with a 90-second start amount of frames. So let's go back into our time configuration panel and let's double the amount of time. So let's go 180 frames, which will give us 6 seconds of animation. Now, if we take a look, you see these dark keyframes here. And the reason they look like this is because our timeline has gotten longer. And you might remember of a couple videos back, I was saying that as your animations get longer, your little tiny increments get tinier and tinier, so it's kind of harder to see what's going on. So our keyframes are very small now, but we can still, we can drag them. So what are these keyframes for? Well, I'd like you to direct your attention to the percent along path. And as we drag our time slider, we can see at the start of the animation we're at 0, And once we get to the second keyframe, which happens to be at 90 seconds, which was the initial length of our animation, we're at 100. So by default, when you set up a path constraint, whatever the length of your animation is, it's going to put a 0% to say that at the beginning of the animation, your path, it's at its beginning of the path, and then at the end of the animation, it's 100%. It's at the end. So since we made our animation longer, we've got to physically drag that keyframe over to the end here, and now it will play throughout the whole timeline. So there goes our teapot zooming around in the world, and it's looping, the animation's looping. Likewise, if we wanted a few seconds to go by, or a second or two to go by before the teapot started moving on its great journey, we could drag that first keyframe forward in time so that that 0%, the teapot wouldn't actually start moving until a few seconds into the animation. So I'm going to bring that keyframe back to the beginning, and there you have it. So, so we ask ourselves, well, why did we do everything we did in the previous lesson? You know, this is so much more advanced. We have so much more control. We can accomplish so much more in fewer steps. Well, there are a whole different animation techniques that as you learn them, you can combine them and create different effects. So for example, we've taken care of motion and rotation of our teapot using our path constraint. But that doesn't mean that for some reason we may not want our teapot to change size or scale over time as it moves. So since we have taken care of our transform and rotation, our movement and our rotation of the teapot using our path constraint, we can now hop into our filters, we can turn off position and rotation, and we can do some scaling of our teapot as it moves along the path. So maybe we want it to start out very small. So let's get our scale tool up, grab the teapot, and maybe we make it very, very small. And we make sure we get into our set key mode. So if you start hitting keyframes without the red here, it's not going to do anything. So make sure you do that. Tiny, tiny, tiny. And then by the end, we want our, by the end, we want our tiny little teapot to have gotten much, much bigger. Okay. So let's take a look at how that looks. Get back over here. Turn off keyframing. So now, and we achieved two things just now by doing this. First of all, it sort of gave the illusion that the teapot was traveling toward us from a much farther distance. So we sort of did some camera trickery there by starting the teapot out really small and then bringing it forward and making it look bigger. So it sort of gave the illusion that the teapot was traveling from much farther away from our camera than it actually was. That was sort of accidental, but we did that, and we also basically scaled the transformation of the teapot from the start of the animation from really small to really big. So in doing that, we have animated all three basic transformations using two different methods. So the path constraint took care of our position and rotation, and we used just regular traditional keyframing to throw a scaling animation into there as well. So in the final tutorial for our set of animation lessons, we are going to add a light and a camera to our scene, and we are going to use path constraints and linking to make sure that our camera is actually following our teapot as things happen in the scene.